Okay, welcome to all of you, even though we can't see you all, particularly those who sit in the far back there. I'm very happy to introduce to you Yuval Benziman, who already has a record. He will be remembered at the University of Maryland forever, because he's the first postdoc person in the Institute for Israel Studies. Being the first, everybody will know his name from now to eternity. Those of you who will listen to him will remember it even better because of the topic that he chose and the way he expresses his way. Yuval is an excellent person who is involved with not only with the academic field but with Israeli public life in general, journalism and literature. He knows Israeli society and the Israeli issues very well. He dealt with it not only from an academic point of view, but also as a journalist who writes for almost the most well-read newspaper in Israel. And in addition to that, he is involved in the public debate about the territories and the future of the conflict, etc. His field is very interesting because he combines two different disciplines which very few, if at all, in Israel did combine, namely, on one hand, literature, on the other hand, international relations or conflict resolution. I guess if there had been more writers being involved in politics instead of politicians, we could have seen peace much earlier. So at least to study the topic maybe will lead us 2 steps, if not more, towards that vision. If we trust only the politicians, particularly if they are men and not women, the probability to see peace in the very near future is not very high. So the topic that he is going to discuss is really the reflection or the presentation of the conflict in Israeli culture, and particularly in Israeli literature. And today, which is the thesis of his PhD, the topic of his PhD thesis, and today he wants to concentrate on the 80s. I guess there might be questions about the 70s and the 90s and even maybe today. So I'm sure you'll be able to entertain these questions. But instead of taking too much time, I will stop here and give you the podium. Please, Yuval.
Although I can only ruin it from now on after this introduction. Thank you. So I do want to concentrate on how the Israeli-Arab conflict is seen is manifested in Hebrew prose fiction and Israeli cultural texts of the 1980s. And I want, first of all, to start in explaining why I think studying cultural texts is important and why I think studying the 1980s when we deal with the Israeli-Arab conflict are the important years to study. And I'll start by explaining why I think I'm interested in cultural text, I'm interested in Hebrew prose fiction, but I'm also interested in Israeli society. I feel that to understand Israeli society, you can look at leaders' speeches, you can do a variety of different studies to do that. You can check the Israeli media, the Israeli public discourse. I think that by studying cultural text, you can know as much about Israeli society and even maybe more than by studying other fields, and I'll explain why. I think that cultural texts have 3 characters, 3 traits that make them more interesting to study. First of all, authors write in their society, and that's why the story that they're telling is probably in some way a reflection of how society sees things. Now, of course, if you have one author writing something, that doesn't really reflect what society thinks about. But if you look at a variety of authors, or a variety of filmmakers, or screenplayers, or any others, each one of them trying to be very unique, tell his own story, has his own characters. But if you look at the overall picture and you see that they more or less tell the same picture time and again, it tells you something about the society in which they write these texts. This is what I find fascinating about this field of cultural research. It's not only one text. It's a variety. If you take 5, 10, 15 texts, and they tell more or less the same story, you have to assume that it tells you something about the reality of the society in which these texts were written. And of course, this and what I'm going to do here and all this cultural research, it does some. It's not fair for the individual texts because each text is different from the other, and is unique in its own way. But then again, if you take 10 or 15 of them together and you see more or less the same story, it tells you something. So this is one thing that the writers write in their own society, and if they all tell the same story, it tells you something about. The second thing is that while they are written in their society, they also influence that society. The public reads these texts and is influenced by them and is moved by them, and it in some ways makes society think in certain ways. Now, of course, it's not that the prime minister sits in his office and reads a poem and says, okay, now I'm gonna do something. It doesn't work like that, but it does have an overall influence about society. If you look, I will talk today mostly about prose fiction, but if you talk about these days, you can see it much more through television shows, for example. In Israel, but I think that here in the United States as well. A lot of people know their politicians, for example, by satire done about these politicians in the TV more than they know the politicians themselves. I guess that in Israel there's a show called A Wonderful Country. Most of the people know their politicians through that show, and not through they know how the politicians themselves. I think that in here, Sarah Palin is more known for how she was seen in Saturday Night Live than people really know her. In Israel, some of our politicians lost their careers because of satire shows as well. And so that's why I think that culture also doesn't, it's not only written, it's in it. Oh, and the best example I like to tell, although I'm not sure it's true, is that, there was a TV show called The West Wing, dealing with the White House, and then they had another TV show done with a woman president. I don't remember the name of it. Anyway, the conspiracy theory behind it was that the people doing this show were the Hillary Clinton people, because they thought, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it's interesting anyway, that American voters can vote for a woman president only after they see a woman president on TV. And I think it makes a lot of sense. You need to see reality on TV before you can believe it can be reality. So again, I think this is why literature, cultural texts are written in their society, but also influence the way society thinks. And when you look at Israel, it's I think it's even more true than in any other place in the world. And the third trait of studying cultural texts, which I find interesting to study, is because the cultural texts that I deal with, they deal with the Israeli-Arab conflict, but they are not obligated to a mimetic representation of the conflict. So they deal with reality, but they don't really have to say what reality is. And by that, I find that they tell stories that are sometimes much more accurate than reality. They're able to talk about things that you are not able to talk in reality, to talk about unconscious things that people don't hesitate to talk about, to say, and it makes them be much more accurate in some of the things they say, because there are things that we cannot say in our day-to-day real life. So these are the reasons for studying cultural texts. And now I want to tell you why I chose to study the 1980s, and that's because I think that at the late 1970s and through the 1980s, something dramatically changed in the Israeli-Arab conflict, or I should say the Israeli-Arab conflicts at that time. And there are three conflicts that I want to talk about: the Israeli relationships with with Arab countries, the Israeli relationships with the Palestinians, and the Jewish-Arab relationships inside Israel. All of these conflicts went through dramatic changes at the end of the 1970s and through the 1980s. If you look at the relationships between Israel and its neighbor countries, the Arab countries, at the late 1970s and 1980s, and the beginning of the 1980s, Israel signed a peace agreement with Egypt. This changed the way of thinking of Israelis, and it's a change in the way that Israel perceived the way it should secure itself. The notion that that Israel can give land and receive peace and quiet it's the first time that it was tested, and it worked. And again, it's a change because it's not that you need as much land to have peace to secure yourself, but you can also have peace for that. And this peace was done by a right-wing government headed by Menachem Begin. 20 years before that, when the option of land for peace was first introduced after 1967, the extreme left said that. At the end of the 1970s, this became the official Israel government's point of view. And so Israel was no longer a country seeking for peace, but it showed that it actually can achieve peace with an Arab country, the most strongest Arab country. That's Egypt. At the beginning of the 1980s, in 1982, the Lebanon War occurred, and this was the first war in Israel history that was perceived by Israeli public itself. I don't know if it's the majority of Israeli public, but large proportions of Israeli public, as a war that Israel initiated, a war that got a lot of criticism inside Israel, a lot of protests, and at the end of the day, Menachem Begin, the prime minister, retired after this war. Ariel Sharon, the Ministry of Defense, had to resign after a public investigation. And these two events, which are they don't go to the same direction. One is making peace, the other is making war, but changed the whole perspective of how Israelis see the conflict. Because on one hand, we can make peace, we can secure ourselves through peace. We have a partner on the other side. On the other hand, we're not as good as we thought we were before. Sometimes we initiate wars and and we're not only defending ourselves, we're not always that right. I think that dramatically changed how Israel sees itself and the conflict with its Arab neighbors. The relationships between Jews and Arabs inside Israel also changed at that time. The date that is mostly known for that is March 30th, 1976, which is known as the Land Day, when there were Arab riots, demonstrations, since Arab citizens of Israel claimed that Israel is taking more and more land from them and making private Arab lands part of the national Jewish Israeli land. These demonstrations ended by 6 Arabs being killed, and the Arab population saying that Israel police used too much of a force against them, and that no Jewish demonstration would end up with 6 people getting killed. Now, but this was the beginning, and of course this conflict between Jewish and Arabs inside citizens of Israel was always there, but this is a benchmark of this conflict being much more apart and known to the Israeli public, and being much more intense than before. Different Israeli sociologists argue different reasons why it's the late 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s that this occurred. Some say it's because of the Palestinization that the Arab community inside Israel went through after 1967. Israel holding the West Bank and Gaza made the Arab citizens of Israel become much more Palestinians than they were before. Other sociologists claim that after the 1977 elections, when the Likud party took over, minority groups that were not heard, that their voice was not heard before, got center of attention. But these minority groups were mostly people that Mizrahim that were not heard of, that their voice was not heard enough before. people from which are not more religious from the right, and while the Arab population, seeing that, suddenly these minority groups do have a voice in Israel public discourse, but they themselves don't, found a way to express it in making this conflict even more intense. Regardless of who's right and who's wrong in this, the Jewish-Arab conflict inside Israel, Israeli citizens, became more intense in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, and this is also the time when a new generation was born, which is now, we'll maybe talk about current Israel at the questions and answers section, but which now has a much louder voice and claims for Israel, for an Arab autonomy inside Israel and things like that. And also, if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it went through dramatic changes at that time, and I'm not here as an historian to say who's to blame here, if it was the Israeli army being more harsh to the Palestinians, or if it was the Palestinians having more demonstrations. But many more accidents between Israeli army and Palestinians were in the 1980s. It all evolved until in 1987, the first Intifada broke. But I think, as a sociologist, Migdal and Baruch Kimmerling of Israel claim that more than the amount of demonstrations going on and more of the Intifada itself, this decade was, in this decade, Israeli establishment understood that it's no more dealing with few groups inside the Palestinians or with few tribes or individuals, but this is a national movement that Israel has to address, that it's a movement that wants its own state, and that it's a real conflict between Israel and the people, the Palestinian people, and not just groups spread out. And so these are the reasons why I thought it interesting to study and to research cultural texts and at these times. And not surprisingly, because of this relationship between reality and fiction, between cultural texts and what happens in the real world, when you look at the cultural texts of the late 1970s and through the 1980s, big changes occurred then. If you look at Israeli theater, Dan Orion studied this. He says he mostly dealt with the portrait of Arabs in Israeli theater, and he says his figures are that if you look at the decade before, 1973 to 1982, he says you had 30 plays in which you had Arab figures, Arab characters. When you look at 1982 to 1994, you have more than 100 plays in which you have Arab characters. The Israeli-Arab conflict is the main thing in these plays, and he also says that the Arab characters are much more are not as stereotyped as they were before. If you look at Israeli cinema at these times, a big change. Many more movies are done about this topic. Ella Shochat, who wrote about this, calls this the Palestinian wave. Suddenly, a big wave of a lot of films done about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She says that this is the time when the Israeli national narrative is no more the dominant narrative in Israeli films, but you have another narrative. She also shows quite interesting things like the fact that you had more Arab actors in these films, and just the existence of Arab Palestinian actors in these films changed the films themselves, because Arab actors said, "I'm not playing this role. This doesn't make sense. We have to change the movie so it makes sense from an Arab point of view." And again, there's a disagreement between scholars dealing with this, if this is a real change in the way Arabs are seen or not. Some say it's still, although you have Arab characters and you have more films, it still also is shown through a Jewish Israeli point of view and not really giving an authentic voice to the Arab characters. Others say that it is a big change. But again, I'll put this aside, and I just want to show you that there's a big change at these times in all these cultural texts. And we can go on. You can see it in Israeli children's books at this time, in Israeli music of this time. You can see it in Israeli books that are taught in schools, and more. And the same kind of things also happened in what I want to concentrate in Israeli prose fiction. Now, of course, I cannot say what happened before what, and it all came together, and probably Hebrew prose fiction changed at this time because of the changes of reality, because of changes in Israeli films and in Israeli cinema, and because of changes in the literary world itself. You had new authors coming in. It's more it's a postmodern time, very individualistic. Things change in that world as well. But again, you can see big changes in Israeli literature, Israeli prose fiction of this time. You have more novels than before about the Israeli-Arab conflict. And let me just say this: I think that the thought is that Israeli prose fiction always deals with the Israeli-Arab conflict because it's such an interesting, it's such a dominant part of Israeli society. But if you look at all the research done, it always focuses on, I don't know, 2 or 3 texts done in the late 1940s, 2 or 3 texts in the 1960s, 1970s, and that's it. There weren't so many texts as people think. The conflict has its part in a lot of things, a lot of the text, but it's not the main topic in a lot of texts done till the 1980s. In the 1980s, it does become really a big topic in Israeli literature, in Israeli prose fiction. You have more novels written about this, which is also a big change and an important change because it's no more short stories. It's novels. Novels, of course, can give a much broader picture. There's more text, so you can also have an Arab voice or different voices. It's not only one voice. The characters themselves are not as stereotyped as before, but they're more round and they're not and have their inner world is much more wide than before. Some texts even have again Arab characters saying their own narrative, which is also a big change. But all of this I want to put aside, and I want to talk about what I see as the big change in the plot itself, in what these stories really tell us. It's not only that there are more texts, it's not only that there are more characters, but I want to tell you what I find these stories really tell us, what's in them. And I want to warn you, it's quite depressing. The first and I think most interesting, because I don't know of any other time that this was the main thing. What I'm going to say now sounds like very not intelligent, but I'll try to explain why I'm saying this. Is that the stories tell a story of not being able to tell a story. So you have texts who are supposed to tell you the story of who tell the story of the Israeli-Arab conflict, but what they are really what they are really saying is we're not able to say the story. And how do they do that? In a variety of ways. First of all, you have novels who are told by different narrators telling the story. The Lover by Yoshua, The Smile of the Lamb by Grossman, Ta'aton by Yitzhak Ben Ner, Shahid by Avi Valentine. In other words, the author, consciously or unconsciously, I don't know, but when it's all, by the way, it's always he. There are almost no women authors at that time. You were referring to that before. But he wants to tell a story of the conflict, and immediately he says, you know what? I need 4 different angles to tell the story. I cannot tell it from one angle. I need 4 different perspectives to tell the story. But each one of these perspectives is also it collapses by itself. You know, this way of telling a story by 4 different angles is called sometimes Rashomon, by the movie Rashomon, in which one scene is shown from 4 different angles, and you're to decide which of the angles is the true one. In these stories, you don't even, each of these different points of views is not coherent by itself. It collapses. The characters don't even represent themselves. And there's an almost obsessive questioning of what's true and what's false, what is reality and what is not reality. You can best see it in David Grossman's The Smile of the Lamb. The leitmotif of this novel is Kan Makan, which is once upon a time, or did it happen or didn't happen. But this is what they deal with. Are we telling reality or is this fiction? What is true and what is false? What is right and what is wrong? And they can't figure it out. So again, in some of the stories, you want to tell a story, well, immediately we need 4 points of views, and each of these points of views also collapses. In other stories of that time are told, again, from different perspective. The Way to En Harod by Kenan, thanks. By Kenan. Half of it is the story, half of it occurs below ground level and half of it above ground level. And they say there's no connection between here and there's no hierarchy here. It's the same thing. Arabesques by Anton Shamas, again, half of it is told by the narrator, half of it is called the story, 2 different times, 2 different places. Some of them go to like a legend kind of story, once upon a time. It's in The Smile of the Lamb, it's in The Optimist, it's in A Good Arab by Om Kanyuk, who has this powers which are not human powers, like almost a fairy tale being told. And the characters themselves, part of this not being able to tell the story is also the characters themselves not being able to talk to one another. For example, and these are only examples, but you have to believe me that you can see it in all the texts of this time, or almost all the texts of this time. There's a movie called Fictitious Marriage. In this movie, you have an interaction between an Israeli Jew who deceives his wife and tells her that he's going abroad. He actually stays in Israel, and he goes to work with Palestinian workers from Gaza. In order to connect with them, he pretends to be mute, and only by being mute he can have some connection with them. But this thing of being mute, you can also see it in Arabesques by Anton Shamas, who has 2, it's a story there about 2 twin kids who are mute and deaf. In A Trumpet in the Wadi, another example, the only interaction that's almost a kind of a communication between a Jew and an Arab is by a Russian Jewish immigrant coming to Israel, and he can communicate with an Arab that teaches him Hebrew. So it has to go that far for any of the characters to be able to communicate with one another. But all in all, to go back to my first point, in order to, what the stories really tell us is we're not able to tell us. They tell us the story of a chaos, of no communication, more than they really tell any story by itself. And again, I think this is something that cannot be said in any other discourse, because any other discourse wants to tell you a story. But these stories tell you we're not able to tell it. It's too complicated to have one narrative told you. To continue that thought, and this is the second point, is that they're almost, the stories tell us of not being able to have any Jewish, Arab, or Israeli Palestinian connections inside the state of Israel. In other words, if you want to have a relationship between Israelis and Arabs, Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, it has to be either outside of the state of Israel or in these ex-territorial places in Israel. What are ex-territorial places? The Smile of the Lamb by David Grossman. There is an interaction between a Jew and an Arab, but it takes place in a cave, which is not inside the Arab community, not inside the Jewish community, it's somewhere in between. In the Wadi, which I just mentioned, it's in an attic. It's not in the house, it's somewhere outside of the house. A Fictitious Marriage, which I just talked about, the movie, where do you have these kind of relationships? In a construction site, not in somewhere that's already built and is part of society, but somewhere off of regular territories. In Tatuon by Yitzhak Ben Ner, in a hospital for the mentally ill. This is the place when you can have Jewish and Arab relationships, but not in the regular society. Either that, or you can have it outside the state of Israel. These stories do have some Israeli-Palestinian meetings, Jewish and Arab meetings, always outside the land itself. By the way, these are just examples, but if I just remembered in Arabesques by Anton Shamas, the same thing. An Israeli author, where does he meet his a Palestinian author and an Arab-Israeli author? In the United States. They cannot meet in the land of Israel, but only outside. And again, just to continue that thought, no love relationships between Jews and Arabs ever ends good. And I just remind you that this is fiction. The authors could have done anything they want. You could have the films ending by an Arab and a Jew holding their hands and going to the sunset. But no. These texts end up with any love relationship between them destroyed. Someone dies, someone goes away, but it never prevails. The characters themselves, well, most of them, or I don't want to say most of them, but a large portion, which is very well noticed, either lose their minds, get insane, or die. I told you it's not. I'm not going to say happy things here. Yeah. So of course, the characters getting insane tell us about reality more than they tell about the characters themselves. They say the conflict is insane, the reality is insane, and it's not them themselves. Just so you believe me, a few examples. Tatuon by Yitzhak Ben Ner, you have a soldier called Holly who's in the west, in the occupied territories, and his body starts to have this stink smell. And so they make him go and shower himself. He doesn't want to, but they make him do it. And but it doesn't matter. He takes a shower, but the smell continues being with him. He finally gets hospitalized in the hospital for the mentally ill. After that, a friend of him from the same unit comes there again. And two other characters in this story end up not being part of society either. In Grossman's Smile of the Lamb, same things happen. In a Good Arab by Kanyuk, two of the main characters lose their minds. In Israelis Lebanon movies, a lot of soldiers lose their minds. It's troubling. And again, you know that the decision of who's sane and who's not sane is a part of society. You know that 30 years ago, homosexuality was defined as being insane in the DSM, in the psychologist manual. So it really tells us a story. These stories tell us a story of society being insane. Societies, it's not only the Israelis and Palestinian society being insane, and not the characters themselves lose their minds. And the fact that there are so many people dead at the end of the stories is also very depressing, because it's not only that.
Sorry.
Maybe it's some of the authors calling. They don't like what I'm saying. I don't know.
Sorry. I thought I switched it off.
The fact that there are so many people, characters dead at the end of these stories is even more depressing than what I said before, because it's not only that you want to tell the story of the conflict, well, it's chaos, we cannot talk about it. It's not only that there's no relationship, it's not only that there's no communication, we can't even see a brighter future, because it all ends up in death. And I can give you a list of how many characters are dead, but instead of giving it, Alex from A Trumpet in the Wadi and Katzman of The Smile of the Lamb and Khaled of Khamsin, the movie, and more, but I'll give you just one example of Chava from A Good Arab by Oren Kanyuk. Why is she a good example? She is shown as a Jewish Israeli hero. She fought for Israel on the way to Jerusalem to fight for Jerusalem. Her car was shot at. It caught fire. She went on the roof. She shot the Arabs. She won. She was a leader. How does she find her death? she is married to an Arab peace guy. Of course, they had good relationships when they were in France, but when they came to Israel, it all collapsed. While they're driving their car, she loses her mind. She takes the wheel of the car and she drives them off the cliff, and she dies. So you have everything together. Relationships outside of Israel, okay. Inside Israel, not okay. She loses her mind, ends up dead. That's the story in a nutshell. But again, these are only examples. It's in the movie Avanti Popolo. It's in the movie Cup Final. It's in Trumpet in the Valley. Alex, this Jewish immigrant coming from Russia, the only guy that can connect to an Arab because she teaches him Hebrew, becomes a part of society, of the Israeli society, only when he is recruited to the army and goes to Lebanon and then gets killed there. This is the story. And another 2 points I want to make before we go to the question and answers is the role of the Israeli army in these texts, which is also very interesting. I find very interesting. The Israeli army is seen as having extraordinary power in Israeli society, which is also true. But I'm talking about the texts. They show the Israeli army as being a very important factor in society. It's almost only the Israeli army has relationships with the others, with the Palestinians, with the Lebanese, with whomever. So the only connection between Israeli Jews and Israeli non-Jews and the Arab countries is through the military. And of course, you can guess that if this is the only relationship, nothing good can come out of it, because it's not between civilians. Israelis, for example, let's take in the Smile of the Lamb, for example, the two of the main characters go to the army because they think this is the only way to change reality. They don't think they can do it through any other way. Just if you go to the army, you can change the Israeli-Arab conflict. But eventually they find that they cannot do anything. So in some way, the army is seen as having the most, having a lot of power in Israeli society, but at the same time not being able to change anything, and which is also a depressing point of view. And lastly, I want to talk about how the Arabs, the Arab citizens of Israel, are seen in these texts. They're seen as citizens of Israel who want to become part of the Israeli society, but Israeli society not enabling them to be so. It's mostly done through the army again. Since they cannot be recruited to the army, only Jews are recruited to the army, so they don't become part of the Israeli society. In some of the texts, it goes to the way it goes so far as if they have to decide between their love for their lover, the Arab lover, and the army. They choose the army. Eventually the relationships continue, but someone dies or something. It doesn't end well. So these Arab characters seem to want to be part of Israeli society, but Israeli society doesn't accept them. And this is true both for stories written by Israeli Jewish authors and written by Arab authors as well. And the last thing I want to say is there, at the 1980s, it's the first time that two books written by Arabs became part of Israeli canon, Israeli mainstream. It's Anton Chamas' Arabesques and Emil Habibi's The Pest Optimist, that was written in the 1970s but translated to Hebrew in the 1980s. By the way, Arabesques was written by Anton Chamas in Hebrew and was never translated to Arabic. But leave that aside. Sorry, I just remembered that. So these two stories written by Arabs also tell a story of Arabs wanting to be part of Israeli society but not being able to do so. And this is important, I think, they also tell a story of the Arab community not being able to live in Israel, in current Israel. They can live if they want to live at this time, they have to live outside of Israel. And if they want to live in the state of Israel, they have to live in their mindset is in 48, before the establishment of the Israeli state. But they cannot live in the Jewish Israeli at current times. So this is the Arab perspective. And so I just want to end before the questions by saying that most of the authors in Israel and most are known to be in the Israeli political system. They're known to be part of the Israeli left, saying we want a solution we want to negotiate with the Arabs. We have a plan of how to do it. It's possible. If you look at their texts, they're not there. They tell a story of not being able to do that. So it's for you to decide if you believe the story they tell in reality or the reality they tell in their stories. Unfortunately, if you look at the last 20 to 30 years, their stories were more accurate than what they talked in reality. But that's for you to decide. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I agree with you that these writers are very influential in Israeli society, but don't you recognize that they really, and your last statement I think shows that they really aren't representative of Israeli society, which is not leftist society now, but the people on the whole have rejected the idea that Arabs want peace and that they're really like the Jews, except in different circumstances. And the so-called intelligentsia in Israel still clings to that position, including the idea that if you give land, you'll get peace, because of the, as you say, the Egyptian example and withdrawal from Sinai. But there are, 5 or 6 other examples where the opposite occurred, and that's what Israeli society really looks to on the whole. But the academics and the intelligentsia, self-proclaimed, take the opposite position.
I wanted to say 2 things. First of all, I think it's not accurate what you're saying about Israeli society. Every poll done in Israeli today shows that there are about 70% of Israelis who want peace and who want a two-state solution.
Everyone.
Yeah,
I'd say 99%.
No, and want a two-state solution. And Israel government now says a two-state solution. So I'm not sure that I agree with you with what you say about Israeli society today. But let's put that aside. You can claim rightly that most of the authors come from the Israeli left. But these are the authors we have. It's not that when I do this research, I say, I'm not taking right writers. I'm not taking people saying other. But this is what is read by, what is written in Israel and what's read by Israelis. And I said this in the beginning, I take only texts which are mainstream, which means some of the marginal texts written are more interesting because they tell even other stories. But I think that what should be studied when you do cultural texts is the mainstream texts, and this is the story that they tell.
I'm not sure. I don't believe that you're selecting.
No,
I agree with you that the intelligentsia, those self-proclaimed ones, believe that, and I think what you're looking at is representative of these Israeli authors in general. But I'm saying those authors aren't representative of society in general. That the population.
That is always true. You have only 10 authors, and they are not representative of all society. But if this is what society reads, then this is what society reads. And again, as I said, I'm not sure that what they're saying, I'm not sure is that far from what society thinks. That's why I think they were accepted there.
Well, that's where I disagree with you.
You spoke generally about cultural text, and you put together prose and movies, etc. Can you distinguish between the different genres? Are prose items in general different than the movies, or are there some things that you can say about theater, which you cannot argue concerning prose?
Yeah. First of all, prose fiction doesn't need that much of money that films do. And some of the money given to the Israeli movie industry is given from Israeli authorities. So I think that prose fiction could be much more tackling the narrative in that way. And you also have Israeli, some of the Israeli films were also, one of the best well-known films is Shtetzbot, Two Fingers from Tzidon, which was done by the military itself. So you have Shaul Mofaz and Itzik Mordechai playing there. They're giving ranks to the guy in the movie. So the movies are more are a bit behind what the prose fiction says in the national narrative. But it's hard for me to say exactly at what years. I think it's a movement that occurred at the late 1970s and through the 1980s, and you see it in theater, in cinema, in prose fiction, all together.
But not on TV.
Not on TV. Yeah, that's your thing. But it was seen in all these texts together, I think.
So what do you see on TV?
At the 80s, no Arabs exist. At the 90s, they are presented by 2% of the news, and only in the news, not in other genres, like drama or something like this. It's only at the beginning of the 2005 that we can see some Arab individuals who participate in some of the genres, but overall the situation
And when
very bad one, and it's worse from 2000, as we know, after 2005.
and the where you have Arab characters in TV, they're very stereotypes, like the big restaurant, they're.
But it was not on prime time, and it was on
Yeah.
Saturday, and it was to the Arab community.
Mhm.
So we have to take it out.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Simple question. You mentioned a book, I think it was, Arabesque.
Hmm.
You said it was not translated into Arabic, but is it in English?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's so complicated, though. Yeah, no, but go for it.
Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, comment about Arabesque. It was never translated into Arabic because Anton never wanted it or allowed it to be. My question is, what do you make of the fact that in the 1980s, arguably the most important piece of Israeli prose fiction is David Grossman's Sea Under Love, which has nothing to do with the conflict. And then by the end of the 80s, leading out of the 80s, comes an entire new wave of young writers, especially young women, who engage with the conflict not at all. I mean, absolutely. So what does this tell us?
I think, and maybe I didn't talk about this enough before, I think that although there's a belief that Israel is obsessed with dealing with this conflict, when you look at cultural texts in general, they're not that obsessed with it. They like to talk about other things. Maybe, by the way, it's got like Israeli literature and Israeli songs started to talk about the Holocaust, I don't know, 30, 40 years after that. Maybe it will take time till Israelis do it more. But I did say, and I think that there are much more texts in the 1980s than before. It's not that if this is the main thing yet, but it's much more than before. And I do think that you're very right in saying that most of the texts don't deal with it. Well, they deal with it, but it's not the main thing in it. And I think it's a part of really trying to deny it, not handle it. Maybe it will take time for them to do it, and maybe it's a way for I think it has to do. I don't know if you want to go into this. I think it has to do with literature becoming what's a cultural text. They become much more easy to read, much more fun, and so they sometimes tend to run away from hard issues which we don't have a good solution to, and which is reading these texts, telling us that we're not able to talk about these texts is very confusing. For a reader, I think it's more confusing than reading a text which has another theme for it.
As you just to answer this last question, there was a very interesting saying by somebody very smart, I'm not going to quote him directly, so I'm not going to mention his name, who said that during the day, the Israelis fight the Arabs and win, but during the night, and I would add and read books during the day, and during the night, the Nazis hunt them and they lose.
Hmm.
Yes, Paul.
Asking about the, or considering the fact Israel has, I think, more books published per capita than any other country in the world. But still, what sort of, how wide is the readership for the serious books you're looking at? My sense in the U.S. is that a pretty small percentage of the population reads anyone who could be called a serious writer. I'm sure it's larger, but how much effect is it having beyond the elite?
I don't have the numbers, and so I cannot really answer this question. I can say that this is why I chose in advance to take only authors and texts that I think that if you ask the Israeli on the street, even if she or he didn't read it, they would say they would. So if what?
Part of the high culture.
Yeah, part of the high culture in Israel. Maybe I think you'll ask an average Israeli, Grossman, Kanyuk, Anton Shama. These are names that they will know. Sure. Probably the films, I think they will know it. I don't know how many really read it, but I agree with you that if you were to study Israel society through cultural texts in the late 1940s and 1950s, I would recommend going to poems. The Silver Platter, Behold, or other things like that. At the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, and I think also 1980s, it's Israeli books. It's still Israeli books. But if you were to study Israeli society today, it will have to be TV and movies. It will not be there. I think the 1980s. It's fair to say that there's still reading going on. Today, it's not. It's far from that. And to continue your question and me not having a good answer, because an additional question to that can be, even if they read it, do they understand what it says? Which you cannot be sure of that. When you look at for example, this can be, I can give a whole lecture about what I'm going to say now, but just in a brief, if you look at the Israeli movies dealing with the Lebanon War, these movies criticize Israel a lot, but I think that the real narrative behind these movies is saying, you know what, we did a lot of things wrong, but we're okay now. All these movies end up with the Israelis going back to Israel, closing the gate, and so all of this criticized inside the movie ends up we're saying we did wrong, but we're okay now. If you ask the average viewer of the movie, I think when they end looking at the movie, they say, wow, we did wrong. They don't understand that what's really beneath that is saying, okay, but now we're okay. So this is also a question, what does the audience understand from the movie? Which, I don't know.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so to what extent do you sort of see the 1980s literature themes and so on as a part of sort of broader Middle Eastern themes, Arab literature at the time? I mean, the sort of pessimism and nobody ending up okay seems very Middle Eastern to me. But I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I don't know well enough Arab literature. As when I started doing my dissertation, I thought of doing like a comparison between these, but since I find it, when you study prose fiction, the words themselves are so important that I thought that reading translations of them, or even studying Arabic to understand them, I couldn't do it. So I really don't know. Again, it's something I don't have a good answer to.
And I think there are a lot of parallels in terms of the sort of cross-cultural interaction interactions that end badly.
Yeah.
But I think that's common in a lot of literatures, actually.
I will be surprised,
Yeah.
but I don't know if what I'm saying is
Yeah,
correct. I would be
that's not
surprised
what
if you would read prose fiction or poems written in the Arab world, which even have such a significant, so many Jewish characters in them.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think so. But I can tell you a good story about this, by the way. Chaim Guri, the Israeli poet, once said that he was speaking to an Egyptian intellectual, I don't remember his name, and this Egyptian intellectual told him that every Israeli intelligence officer should read poems. And why so? Because he said, if Israel's army intelligence would have read the poems written by Egyptians after 1967, they wouldn't be surprised by the Yom Kippur War. They would understand where we're going. Chaim Guri answered him. That I don't believe Chaim Guri's answer, but I'll give it because, he said, if Egyptian soldiers or Egyptian government would have read the Israeli poems written after 1973, you wouldn't have been surprised by the 1977 peace, by the peace agreement. But I don't know. It's a nice story. I don't know if it's accurate. But
Did the trends that you described in the 80s continued in the 90s, or they've changed?
I think that I want to say two things about this. First of all, this complete chaos that was in the 80s, I feel that there was a need to have some kind of a new narrative after this chaos, and this narrative, I think, can be seen in, for example, what I said about the Lebanon War movies. So we can say a lot of how difficult this conflict is, but we're always okay at the end, and I think you see it as time goes. So that's one thing. You can see that the army, it's true in the 80s, but also in the 90s and through 2000, is not hurt by this chaos. The army is also always seen as okay, the Israeli army. So you can have a lot of criticism to the government, to what's going on, but the criticism never goes to the army itself. But I think that the main things that I said before continue to go. I mean, look, there was a movie, The Bubble, done 4 years ago. Yeah, it ends up with a Palestinian bombing itself in the middle of Shenkin, The Bubble. In Tel Aviv. You look at the last novel by David Grossman, a tragic story as well. I think this tendency keeps on continuing through the 1990s and 2000. Yet there's a change in all color. It's easier now, for example, to make films. It's much easier to produce books. Israel has more books printed per capita than any other place in the world. So what you see when you study the 1980s, it's quite easy. You have 8 or 10 novels and you're finished. There's not much more than that. If you look at the 1990s and 2000, there's a variety of more text, and so you can see other things in it. But I think the major narrative is the same.
In this period, have there been waves of reacting overtly against the themes of the past? You're talking about some gradual changes, but has literature reflected criticism of the sorts of things you're saying? Have they been taken up, and then a new generation goes in a very new direction?
First of all, I think that what always happens inside the literature or the prose fiction world is that you have some writers in the generation before that their writing enables the next generation to write like this. It's in the late 1940s and 1950s, you had Samech Izhar writing The Prisoner, or Chir Bet Chizeh, and by that, when Amos Oz and Aleph and Abi Yoshua started writing in the 1960s and 1970s, they didn't have to start everything from step one. Someone did the first job for them, and this is why when you go to the 1980s, they're able to describe this chaos, because in the 1960s and 1970s, there was still one narrative. There was not this chaos, but this narrative was questioning how the first narrative, the national narrative of 48, is true. And so I think there's some change, a gradual change, that each decade is built on the decade before.
So the change is more gradual.
Completely gradual. And you take what's called the Dora Palmach, the Palmach generation, and then you take the state generation, and then you have the generation of the 1980s. It's gradual. It's always working. They're different from one another, but it's because of what happened before, and sometimes because they want to kick the others away, that they have to produce something which is completely different from them.
Well, how conformist is the writers, are the writers in Israel? Do you have opposite points of view? People who say, well, maybe the Arabs aren't in favor of peace like that, and maybe they have Arab characters who want to kill all Jews, or do you have any of those kinds of writers in Israel, or is everybody of the same bent now?
I don't think it's the same, but again, I just mentioned the movie The Bubble, for example. It ends up with a Palestinian suicide bombing. So it's I don't see it, and this is why I think studying fictional texts is more interesting, because it's not a black and white situation. It's not, as I tried to describe, the texts are not saying the Jews are right, the Arabs are wrong, or the Arabs are right and the Jews are wrong. You have this perception but when you read the text themselves, it's not like that at all. It's a confusion. It's telling a story which cannot be told. It's everyone is to blame, and everything, and everyone is the victim. But it's not clear black and white. The Arabs are good and the Jews are right, or the other way around.
I just want to say something about the process from the 80s until today, and if we are looking at the relationship between the socio-political reality on one hand, and on the symbolic reality, which fiction and cinema are within it, it went a very big step from the 80s until today, especially the symbolic reality that changes from one governmental channel, for example, all the ecological media sphere changed. So this is the place where popular culture is very, very, became very, very prominent. So all these new genre of writing can be located due to these changes in the media, in the symbolic reality on one hand. And we have to remember that something also happened in the economic sphere from the mid of the 80s, and privatization of culture became more and more prominent. So all these we have to put and change also the perception of collectivism versus individualism. Until the end of the 70s, when we are looking at surveys, individualism was a very bad thing to talk about. And suddenly, because of all these changes in both spheres, suddenly we can talk about ourselves. We don't have to talk about the nation state. We don't have to talk about anything. And I think that also because of a lot of young women came in, which really tried to shed light on women's life in Israel, which it wasn't there at all. We heard that all the writers were men, middle-aged men, white, and secular, something like this. And it was suddenly another sphere another people who entered this sphere, and it changed totally. So people are reading now popular culture, not high culture, because we are not talking about the high culture and low culture anymore. We are talking about popular culture. And popular culture is, it's for the middle, as we can see in television, for example, high culture people who watch also low culture things. So it's very confusing.
And to continue that, some of what you call serious writers in Israel, some of their texts are very popular culture today, which also changed the writers themselves changed the way they write, I think.
Or example?
I think that if you read all of them, by the way, but if you look at David Grossman as an example, his first novels, See Under Love, the first one is The Smile of the Lamb, See Under Love, are quite different from novels he wrote after that. Like
even the last one.
No, the last one is I find it in between. But if you look at novels he wrote after that, like Yesh Eladim Zigzag, Yesh Eladim Zigzag, or the other one, forgot its name. Mishu Larutz Ito. These are two novels which are completely popular culture. Great, by the way, I think, but very, and they were much more. They sold much more than the others, and I think that the last one he has is somewhere in the middle. But it's not like it's always serious or always popular. It's somewhere in.
Is poetry part of your analysis or not at all?
When I teach here, I teach poetry mostly at the late 1940s and 1950s, and some in the 1960s. I tend not to deal with it because it's not mainstream in Israel anymore. It used to be, the legend is, I don't know if it's true, that when the soldiers fought in '48, they had the poems in their tadal, in their bag. I don't know if it's true, but no doubt that Alterman and Guri had an influence about in Israel society much more than poets today, who probably no one knows their names. Maybe someone knows Dalia Rabikovic, who's not alive anymore, but who's not alive anymore. But I'm saying other poets in Israel, I think, are not known anymore. Poets are not read as before, and that's why they're not a part of my study. And again, I'm saying, if I was concentrating in the world of literature by itself, it's very interesting, and they're more radical than these texts are. But again, they're not read, so I don't think they can really reflect to you what's thought in society and what's read in society.
What about Israeli theater? I mean, Hanoch, Levin, Sobol, they at least have reputations as radicals. Is that more radical or different from what you see in fiction?
They are a bit more radical. But again, Hanoch Levin, everything he writes is more of a chaos than anything else. Not having one theme, but that. And again, some of the plays written at these times are tell stories which are. Hanoch Levin, for example, is mostly known from Merkat Ambatya, which was very controversial. But others plays written that time, I think, and as I said, Danovian says there are over 100. I don't know all these 100, but the 10 or 20 that I looked at were telling more or less the same story, not far more extreme than these. I have to remember Sobel's. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that.
Any other question?
I have a question.
All right.
Being that the readership is mostly more educated and it's not a popular pastime activity in many of the Israeli society, I wonder whether there is another polarization between the religious, even like the people that are educated people. Are they reading also those books that you mentioned, or were they reading during the 80s?
Again, I don't know this. I guess that they're reading much more than the secular society. This is from the people. I can't say this from a real. I didn't investigate. The people that I know who are kibbutz zugot read much more of these texts than my secular friends. That's my general comment, but it's only from what I know personally. It's not like I investigated.
Because I have the impression that reflects and maybe adds to the division of the Israeli society, the fact that they're reading different things.
Maybe so. I can't say this as a fact, but I don't know. But again, as I tried to show, I think that if the kibbutz zugot would have read these texts, at least as I read them, their narrative is quite reflected there more maybe than the secular left people.
All right. Thank you very much for an interesting